What is up? What is going on? Welcome back to the COVID-19 War Room. I am your host, Coach Patterson. This is it. This is the last one. Last one for the year. Last unit that we need to go over. Last PowerPoint that we need to make and go over and make sure that you understand everything in this unit. Last video we talked about the oil industry. Today we're going to talk about cotton, cattle, and the railroads in Texas. Without further ado, let's jump into it. So the first thing we need to talk about is economy. So when you think of economy, what kind of words do you think of? So we're going to talk about a couple different things in the next couple slides, and that is going to be supply and demand. And so when supply is low and demand is high, the price will go up, and we'll see that with the Nintendo Switch. When the demand is low and the supply is high, the price will go down. If the demand and the supply are constant, the price will stay the same. So that's the basic economic principle that you need to know based on, and that goes with oil too. Right, so when the demand of oil is high, but the supply is really low, that oil price is going to go up and up and up. When the demand is the same, and the supply is, a lot, there's a lot in the market, that price is going to go down because you've got to sell the stuff. Right? And so that's what we need to talk about first before we can really get into this stuff. And so you'll notice, this is kind of a basic principle that you'll know, but you just have to think through the situation before you can answer a question about it. Okay, so let's look at some examples. So demand and supply. Okay, demand is how many people want it. So if that's 3, then obviously the demand is not very high. If the demand is 3 million, then that's going to be pretty high. Supply is how much you have in inventory, basically. Okay, so how many things do you have to sell? So this right here, excuse me, is a iPhone launch. Okay, New York City, Apple Store launching the new iPhone. You can see that people are camped out. Why do you think that people are camped out here? Probably because the supply is going to be low and their demand is really high. And so they're ready to pay top dollar for this new iPhone that's coming out, and they don't really care. Right? You could wait a couple months, that demand will that curve will kind of flatten out, and then the price starts going lower. You start getting sales, you start getting deals. You go to your cell phone retailer and they say, hey, we'll give you, $300 off the new iPhone if you sign a new agreement, whatever it is, right? Things start to switch, okay? But at that point, the demand is high. So this is GameStop, video game release, right? The demand for this video game is very high. So at this point, you're going to pay top dollar for it until you wait, 3-4 months. For example, I just bought a game the other day. It was normally $60. I got it for like $30. So that's a 50% discount. It's been out a couple months, but I haven't really had time to play anything with sports and things like that. So now that that's over, I can have a little bit more time to play a little Xbox. And so I'd save 50% by waiting just a couple months. So here's the Nintendo Switch. So in the Nintendo Switch, and this is probably the best real world example that I can give you. So when the Nintendo Switch came out, everybody wanted it, right? And they listed it. Nintendo said, okay, we're going to sell this thing for $300. If you look here, this is kind of a map, or I'm on Target. And so can we find the Nintendo Switch at Target? No, it's nowhere near me. Okay, so the demand for this item is really high. It's sold out at all the Targets in the area. Okay, so what are we gonna do? Well, then you get people like this who buy the Nintendo Switch for the purpose of selling it. Okay, so the demand is still high. How bad do I want this Nintendo Switch? right? So we saw here it's $299, right? Top corner right here, $299. Okay, great. Right here, and go on Craigslist and get it $475, $500, $550, $500, $650, right? That demand is high, so that price is gonna naturally go up. So this is the same thing that happened for beef after the Civil War. So when the Civil War started and ended, the demand for beef went up. Texans stopped growing cotton and started raising more cattle. Okay, the United States as a whole wanted more beef. Okay, by the end of the Civil War, millions of longhorns roamed freely throughout the state. Many farmers had to find new ways to make money and feed their families, so they turned their attention to cattle. Right? If you have a demand for cattle, then the price is going to go up. So people saw it as a money-making opportunity, so they started raising cattle instead of farming. Here's just a funny little meme. I need 5 courses for dinner, and each course will be steak. Right? So this is kind of playing up the fact that the demand for beef was really high. You want beef, man? Right? Not like, do you want to fight? No, do you want cattle beef? So with the demand for cattle, you also had to find new ways to transport it. And so people went and turned to cattle drives. Okay, so on the right side is a map of the cattle drives, and so let's figure out why you would need a cattle drive. So these ranchers that were raising cattle, they needed a way to chase, brand, rope, drive their cattle. Okay, so they're gonna hire white guys, Mexican guys, black cowboys to do all of that stuff. Okay, and so the demand for Texas beef, the demand in Texas for beef was low, but the rest of the United States was really, really high. So you had to take these cattle from Texas, from these ranches in Texas where, you know, the land is very vast. You had to take these cattle from Texas to the rest of the United States. Now, the problem was, if you can see on this map, we'll make it a little bit bigger here. The problem was that you had railroads up here in the north. Okay, so these little dotted lines here that my mouse is following are going to be railroads. You have nothing down here. Okay, so these people are going to have to take their cattle from down here south of Texas, south in Texas, and they're going to have to take them up to the railroad so that they can then get them to the rest of the United States. Now, why do you need to do that? Because if the demand is low in Texas, right, you're going to go and sell where the demand is high. If cattle is readily available in Texas, nobody really needs it, right? The supply is really high, so the demand is kind of low. You have to take it where the supply is low and the demand is high. So people in New York and the East Coast, they want beef. They've got to get it to there. So it's not like today where you could just load it on an 18-wheeler and it'll be there in 2 days. This is kind of one of those things that you have to take it to the train, and the train is going to be your best option to get cattle to the East Coast and to slaughterhouses so they can have fresh beef. So numerous trails are going to pop up, and these aren't like organized trails. These are just going to be kind of paths that just get worn out over time. Right? It's like nobody's out there paving the trail or cutting it up. These are just going to be paths that people have found over the years and that they've worked. So basically, a cattle drive is going to take them from one place to the next, and so you're going to have a bunch of cowboys out there that are just going to be driving cattle, organizing to make sure that the herd stays together all the way up. And these are going to take weeks and weeks at a time, but it's just the only way that the cattle can move. Okay. So again, here's the map. You can kind of see the trails that everybody's going to take. So what is life on the trail like? I mean, we don't have anything like this right now. In these times, so it's just got to be what history tells us. So cattle drives were very difficult and dangerous. Number one, you had to deal with animals, you had to deal with bad weather, water shortages, prairie fires, cattle wrestlers, somebody that comes and like steals cattle from the trail. Now if you think about it, right, you can't keep these animals in, you know, an organized pack. Okay, so you're basically just kind of wrangling cows, making sure they all kind of keep walking, keeping up the rear, and hopefully all of them stay in some sort of order. Right, so if one strays and you got a cattle wrestler that's waiting for this opportunity, they're just going to go in there and take it, and then they're going to eat the beef, and that's money lost from the rancher, which means it's money lost to the cowboy. So if the cowboy doesn't get all the money for the rancher, then the cowboy's not getting paid that much. So they had to meet tight deadlines. Some cowboys are riding 24 hours at a time and just kind of slept on their horse. What's not always talked about here is how good these horses were. Right? If you think about sleeping on a horse, right? This horse pretty much knows exactly what they're doing. Right? They're well trained. They're smart enough to know, like, I don't need to be directed. Okay, so the horse can basically just ride itself. You don't even really need a cowboy if the horse is, you know, well trained. You need a cowboy to keep the order, and kind of if anything goes wrong, right, you need that human element. But for the most part, the horse knew exactly what they were supposed to be doing. So the Goodnight-Loving Trail is going to be one of the most famous herding trails from Texas to Wyoming. And so this is going to be this one right here, in the thick, the bold dotted line. So it's going to go from San Angelo, Texas, all the way up to Cheyenne, Wyoming. And then you have the Chisholm Trail, which goes from San Antonio up to Kansas, where they meet the railroad there. And so this is going to be, you know, basically the two main trails that are ridden out of Texas. That Goodnight-Loving Trail is responsible for building the first chuck wagon. So somebody that would, you know, kind of come on the drive there for the cowboys, that would hold food and basically supplies and things that they could cook for the cowboys. And if you ever heard, you know, hey, we're gonna have a chuck wagon cookout, basically just cooking out in the prairie, in the fields, you know, for the cowboys. And so they ate a lot of beans, used a lot of cast iron, things like that, open fires, and you know, they'd set up camp for, you know, probably the night, and the chuck wagon person would be in charge of, you know, cooking dinner for everybody and making sure that everybody had what they needed and everybody was well supplied. So it's just an extended version of that map. You can see it, San Antonio to Kansas, and then San Angelo to Wyoming for those two trails, those two most famous trails. So the Chisholm Trail, obviously we talked about it being famous from Texas to Kansas. Started in San Antonio, ran through Austin and Fort Worth before crossing into Indian Territory, and then, which Indian Territory is now Oklahoma, and then into Kansas. So took months for the trail boss, 10 cowboys, a cook, and a horse wrangler, and a herd of 2,500 cattle. It's going to take 3 months for them to get to San Antonio to Kansas. Which, if you think about it now, let's do some research. If we wanted to go from San Antonio to, let's see, San Antonio, I'm pulling it up on Google Maps. If we want to go from San Antonio to Abilene, Kansas, it would take us, San Antonio to Abilene, Kansas, 11 hours in the car. 10 hours, 37 minutes to be exact. Basically on the same path that they took, right? Through Oklahoma City, through Wichita, Kansas, and then you're there. So you got to realize, like, that's in a car. You're not walking 2,500 cattle through forests and prairies and things like that, and then having to stop every night. And so this is a lengthy process that you have here. So in 1871 alone, 600,000 longhorn cattle were herded to Kansas through this trail, which is it's a lot. It's a lot of beef. If you stop and think about it, you know, the amount of beef that you get from one cow, family of 4 could maybe eat it in a year. Trust me, I know. We used to, from stock shows and rodeos and things like that, we used to buy whole cows, and you take that to the butcher, and they make ground beef and steaks and brisket and all that. And so like, there's so much beef, right? If you ate it every day, you could maybe get through it in a year. A half a cow is what we started going to, just because there's so much meat that you had to keep, frozen and then defrost it to cook it, whatever. So hopefully that's better. Sorry, the microphone was messing up. It's just a picture, kind of a sculpture reenacting the livestock drives. So with this cattle boom, you have kind of railroads and things being made, which made it easier and faster to transport cattle to new markets. But then you have refrigerator trucks or refrigerator cars developed, and this is going to play a huge role in the cattle industry, because it's going to make it a whole lot easier to transport the cattle. So instead of driving it up to a railroad location and then loading a live cow on a truck or a train car, and then taking that to a butcher, a slaughterhouse, and then unloading it, they slaughter it, and then they can distribute it from there. You can now slaughter it in a region. Alright, so Fort Worth, you could take those cattle at the stockyards of Fort Worth, and you can slaughter them there, refrigerated everything, and then put it on this refrigeration train and take it to the industry. And now you've kind of eliminated the need for a cattle drive. And so instead of driving, right, now you've got people that are just keeping cattle in their property. And so the invention of barbed wire fences is going to come up. So barbed wire has made it possible for farmers and ranchers to open the range, in the open range, to protect their crops and their cattle by basically fencing off their land. Many large ranches were fenced off sources of water, even though they didn't own the land on where the water was located, making it harder for smaller farmers, which limited the open range. So this is going to kind of shut off the openness of it. And so then with all things like this, you're going to get some pushback, right? And so we have the fence cutting war. So in 1883, Texas was hit by a drought. Cattle began to die with no access to water because these people have fenced it in. So then you're going to start getting people that are going to start cutting fences. In 1883, more than $20 million in damage was done just in cutting fences. So a law was passed that made fence cutting illegal, and ranchers were banned from putting up fences on land that they did not own. So this is going to go down in history as the fence cutting war, but there was literally no bloodshed, right? It was just one guy going over there cutting a fence, and then the other person building it back, and then so on and so forth, right? This is happening all over the open range because people are trying to get to the water that people have fenced in. And so here's a process to just put in a fence. Nowadays we have what's called a come along, which is to help stretch that wire fencing. But in the old days, you just kind of pulled it as hard as you could, and then somebody would put a nail or something into that fence post that they could keep it taut and keep it from moving. All good things have to come to an end. We know this, right? So in 1885, the demand in the eastern part of the United States for cattle began to drop, beginning the cattle bust. First it started as a cattle recession, then it started as just a bust, right? Nobody really wanted it. It was becoming a very easy thing to get, right? Cattle, I mean, people started eating more chicken, right? You have more things coming into the market at this point, and so the cattle industry is really going to suffer, which is going to drive the cattle business drive down, or the cattle drive business down, and many cattle died and ranchers went out of business because they had nothing to feed their cattle in the winter. And if you're trying to keep cattle, right, most of the time that they would drive these cattle up right before the winter hit, so that they didn't have to feed them anything. So when you're not making money selling cattle, then you can't buy feed, and then everything's basically going to die. So cattle today in 2017, the industry has decreased as a whole. A high cost for feed, dropping in sale price, this, that, and the other. Now, are there still people that farm and raise cattle? Absolutely. But when you saturated that market so much, right, you had a very high supply and a not so high demand, that price went down. So a lot of people got out of the business, and now you just have a select few that are going to stay in the cattle business. So we needed new ways to make money on these ranches. So what in the world were we gonna do, right? So you started having hunting trips, right? They realized, hey, I've got deer on my property. I can just sell hunting trips. I can sell bird watching tours, right? I can create a dude ranch where people can come and act like a cowboy. People from the city can come and they can ride a horse, and we can eat out of a chuck wagon and things like that. And that'll, they'll pay me, $200 to do it, and that's for the weekend, and that's crazy, right? So if I get, 10 people at a dude ranch for the day, I just made, $2,000. Okay, that's pretty good, right? Do that every day of the week, even every weekend, right? You're making $100 and something thousand a year just by doing it 10 people every weekend. So these ranches are going to have to figure out new ways to make money. And then you have the cotton boom. So cotton growing was time consuming. You needed a lot of labor. You needed a lot of fertilizer, things to keep the soil good. And without slavery, this kind of took a little toll. But with slavery, you had slaves able to fertilize and till the land, pick cotton, everything like that. And then you had the introduction of the cotton gin, which is going to change the cotton industry. So the cotton gin is going to make it to where you could take raw cotton and make it, kind of refine it, and make it useful in something, so you stopped having to do it by hand. So anytime you can put a machine involved into it, it's going to make things faster, it's going to make things easier. And that's exactly what the cotton gin is going to do. So Texas was booming in the cotton industry. And then you had the Civil War. So Confederate troops needed food and not cotton. So this is kind of where you get the cattle industry from coming. So farmers stopped planting cotton, put slaves to work growing wheat and corn to feed the soldiers. And so they're going to kind of switch it over, which is going to drive the supply of cotton down. So after the Civil War, you had this great need for cotton because nobody had been planting it. So factories in the East demanded cotton for clothes, shoes, and other products. Textile factories made cloth using cotton, and so Texas farmers began to grow the cotton again. Because again, if you look at the economics of it, supply is low, demand is high. What does that do for the price? It makes it go up, right? So when you talk about money making, and that's what the farmers in the business to do. They're in the business to make money. If you think like, hey, they're helping us, they farm because they want to feed people. No, they may want to feed people, but they also want to make money. And so when you get into this, what should we grow? What's going to make the most money for us? And that's going to be cotton. Unfortunately, then you had the cotton bust, because all good things come to an end, right? It's a rise and a fall. So other states started to grow cotton, which took away the monopoly that kind of Texas had built. And so when you get other states growing cotton, you get more supply. When you get more supply and the demand stays the same, what happens to the price? It goes down. So now people stopped growing this because it wasn't making a whole lot of money. Many farmers outside of Texas grew cotton and lowered the price because of that supply and demand. No more slaves means that people had to pay their workers or use sharecroppers. And then you had the boll weevil beetle, which is going to kill the cotton crop. And so if you have one bad year of a cotton supply, it's not going to look good for you. So railroads, why do we have them? Why do we need them? We kind of talked about it here in the oils or the cotton section, or the cattle section, excuse me. We talked about it in the cattle section. Why do we need them? We need them to move goods, right? So we needed to build to transport products. In the 1880s, thousands of miles of railroads were laid in Texas. This was a cheap way to ship cotton all over the United States. So we have a transcontinental railroad going in the United States, which is going to mean it stretches from coast to coast, so east coast to west coast, go all the way across the United States. Now, not necessarily in a continuous fashion, right? It doesn't just go, but you can get on a train and go from coast to coast. You may have to change trains a couple times, but you'll get there eventually. So the Transcontinental Railroad stretches across the entire continental United States, connecting east and west by railroad. Trip from California to Iowa once took 6 months by wagon, now took only 15 days on a railroad. So you're talking a major drastic difference there. So the railroad boom in 1883, Northern Pacific Railway connected the northern sections of the United States from Minnesota to Washington. Southern Pacific completed 20 years of project, which you can see down here. So it goes from New Orleans up to Sacramento, California. You have Central Pacific that goes into the, from out here to California. And by 1893, the Great Northern Railroad was complete. So here's just that extended map. You can kind of see this stuff right here. This is excluding all of the railroad that was already here, but this is going to connect. This is the transcontinental connection piece that we were looking for. So railroads in Texas, these are just kind of specific to Texas, didn't really go outside of Texas. You had the T&O, which was a railroad. You had the I-G&N, which is going to connect Longview to Laredo, going through San Antonio, Austin, Rockdale, and Hearn. This one's still used quite a bit today. Then you had the FW in DC, which is going to be Fort Worth to Amarillo. So just a bigger deal here. Kind of see where they go, what they're connecting. So this TMP, I put T&O on the other one on the slide. This should be T&O. It should be TMP, excuse me. So East Texas out to West Texas. This is going to be a big one. Big travel, right? Connecting that area is going to be huge. So some positive and negatives of the railroad industry. Number one, you connected Texas to the rest of the United States, which is easier to transport people and products. Every stop, much like an oil town, every stop that the railroad made, it produced a town, right? So you wonder how these little towns in Texas kind of got started. These are going to be basically because of the railroad industry. So if you see a railroad, you could say, man, probably happened because the railroad industry came through there. So it's kind of a boom town in the sense of being on the railroad. Some negatives, Chinese men that came, and that's not really a negative except for the fact that you took jobs from everybody else that was already in Texas. So you couldn't really make the Chinese people would come over here and do the labor for much cheaper, and so they ended up building most of the Transcontinental Railroad, which you'll see in the video if you watch it, right? Especially the one here in Texas, El Paso to San Antonio on the Southern Pacific line. They're going to build most of that, and so then they stayed and they opened restaurants and laundry services, which again taking jobs and businesses from Texas, just because of the cheap labor that they offered. And so Texans wanted them to go home. So these Chinese men were attacked, beaten, businesses burned to the ground, and it got so bad that America finally banned Chinese immigration from entering the United States for a little while, and so that was not so good. And that's it. That's all I have for you. This one's kind of a long one. I apologize. I didn't think it would be this long, but we kind of got carried away into the economic side of it. But that's it. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you enjoyed all of these, because we're done. This is the last unit that you have to see. You don't have to watch anymore. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you got something out of it. Hopefully you're staying up on your schoolwork. It's been my pleasure to do these videos and keep it kind of normal for everybody during this COVID-19, and even afterwards, if you're watching this video well after this COVID-19, you're welcome. It's been my pleasure. Hopefully you got something out of it. I would say we'll see you in the next one, but there's not a next one. So I enjoyed it. We'll see y'all around.